The Positive Theory of Capital by Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Book 4. Price. Chapter 7. The Law of Costs. In the sphere of price, as in the theory of subjective value, we find a law firmly rooted in economic literature and accredited by common experience. It tells us that the market price of goods reproducible at will tends to equalize itself in the long run with costs of production. The following perfectly valid line of argument is usually adduced in proof of this: the market price of goods reproducible at will cannot in the long run be maintained either much above or much below their cost. If at any time the price of an article rises appreciably above the cost, its production will be particularly profitable to the undertakers. This will not only induce the latter to extend their already flourishing businesses, but will encourage new undertakers to enter the same remunerative branch of industry. Thus the amount of product brought to the market will be increased, and finally, according to the law of supply and demand, a fall in price will ensue. If conversely, at any time the market price falls below cost, continued production will show a loss. Many undertakers will reduce their output, the supply of the commodities will be reduced, and this, finally, in virtue of the law of supply and demand, will lead to a raising of the market price. From this law of cost has gathered a great mass of theoretical detail, which may, for our purposes, be left entirely on one side. Our whole interest is centered in the question as to the position which the law, so well accredited by experience, takes in the systematic theory of price. Does it run counter to our law of marginal pairs or not? Our answer is that it does not. It is as little of a contradiction as we before found to exist between the proposition that the marginal utility determines the height of subjective value, and the other proposition that the costs determine it. The line of thought, which in both cases leads to the solution of the apparent contradiction, is the same, feature for feature, except that, in the present case, in virtue of the intervention of exchange, in virtue, that is, of the translation of the phenomena out of individual economy into social economy, there appear richer developments at every station on the line of thought. In what follows I shall try, as briefly and clearly as possible, to describe the concatenation between value, price, and costs, and I think I am not exaggerating when I say that to understand clearly this connection is to understand clearly the better part of political economy. The formation of value and price takes its start from the subjective valuations put upon finished products by the consumers. These valuations determine the demand for those products. As supply over against this demand stand in the first instance the stocks of finished commodities held by producers. The point of intersection of the two-sided valuations, the valuation of the marginal pairs, determines, as we know, the price, and of course determines the price of each kind of product separately. Thus, for instance, the price of iron rails is determined by the relation of supply and demand for rails, the price of nails by the relation of supply and demand for nails, and similarly the price of every other product made out of the productive good iron, such as spades, plowshares, hammers, sheet iron, boilers, machines, etc., is determined by the relation between the supply and demand which obtains for these special kinds of products. To make this perfectly clear, let us assume that the relations between requirements and stocks of the various iron products, and accordingly their prices to begin with, are very various, that the price of a quantum of commodity which can be made out of one and the same unit of productive material, for instance from a hundredweight of iron, varies from 2s. for the cheapest to 20s. For the dearest class of products, these prices are the result of the position of the market at the moment, and we have first assumed that the stocks of products, the supply, are a given quantity. But they are only for the moment a given quantity. As time goes on, they are always getting supplemented from production, and this makes them a variable quantity. Let us follow the circumstances of this production. For the manufacture of iron fabrics, producers, of course, require iron. Under the system of division of labor, they must buy this in the iron market. The manufacturers represent this demand for iron. As regards the extent of the demand, it is clear that every producer will buy as much iron as he requires to produce that amount of the commodity which he may expect to sell among his customers. But how will it be as regards the intensity of the demand? Obviously no producer will give more for the hundredweight of iron than he can get for it from his own customers in the shape of price. But up to this point, even in the worst case, he can and will compete rather than let his production come to a standstill for want of raw material. The manufacturer, therefore, who can profitably employ the hundredweight of iron if he gets 20 shillings from his customers will be a buyer in the iron market up to the price of 20 shillings as maximum. He who can profitably employ the hundredweight of iron at 16 shillings will, naturally, not buy at a price over 16, and so on. In this way the market price which each producer of iron wares gets for his particular wares, or the share of the market price which falls to iron according to the law of complementary goods, furnishes him with the concrete valuation which he has in his mind when joining in the demand for iron. The supply which stands over against this demand consists of the stocks of iron held by the mine owners and iron masters. These stocks will pass, in methods familiar to us, in the possession of the most capable buyers, and at a price which approximately corresponds to the valuation of the last buyer. Suppose the stocks of iron are sufficient to meet the demand of all those buyers who value the iron from 20 shilling down to 6 shilling per hundredweight, the valuation of the last buyer, and thus the market price of the iron will stand at 6 shilling. And we now have to consider the causal connection which has ended in the price. It runs in the clearest possible way, in an unbroken chain from the value and price of products to value and price of costs, from iron wares to raw iron, and not conversely. The links in the chain are these: the valuation which consumers subjectively put upon iron products form in the first link. This helps next to determine the figures of the valuation, the money price at which consumers can take part in the demand for iron products. These prices, then, determine in methods with which we are now familiar, the resultant price of iron products in the market for such products. This resultant price, again, indicates to the producers the exchange valuation which in turn may attach to the productive material iron, and thus the figure at which they may enter the market as buyers of iron. From their figures, finally, results the market price of iron. But still another and very important connection may be gathered from all this. It is that we have simply the great law of marginal utility fulfilling itself. According to that law, the available stock of goods is successively conducted into the most remunerative employments, put to the most advantageous uses, and the last use to which the goods are put determines their value. In any individual economy, the most remunerative uses are seen to be those which express the most urgent subjective wants, and the value which emerges as a result of these individual relations is purely personal subjective value. In the more extended sphere of a market, on the other hand, everything is referred no longer directly to subjective wants, but to those wants as mediated by money, money being, as it were, the neutral common denomination for wants and feelings of various subjects which are not immediately commensurable. Here emerge as the most remunerative employments, not those which express the wants absolutely most urgent, but those which are represented by the highest money valuation, that is, the best paying employments, and the value which results in objective exchange value. Thus it is, first of all, with iron products. In their respective markets they pass to the best paying buyers, and the price which expresses the valuation of the last buyer determines their market value and price. But so it is also, in the second place, in a slightly roundabout way, with the cost good, iron itself. In the iron market it goes to the best paying producers, and the valuation of the last of these determines its price. But here the producers are simply mediators, in their conducting of the iron to their best paying consumers. The stock of iron really passes successively to the most remunerative forms of consumption, and the last of these forms provided for determines through the valuation named by the last producer who enters the market as buyer, the market price of the cost good, iron. It is not this cost good, then, that dictates its fixed price to the products that proceed from it. On the contrary, it receives its own price by the medium of the price of its products, in conformity with the great law of marginal utility, according to which the available stock is forced into the most remunerative employments, and receives its price from the money valuations of the last of these. But connected with this is a series of subsequent phenomena which, obviously, have given rise to the opinion that costs exert a causal influence on the price of products. So long as the price of various products made from iron varies between 20 shilling and 2 shilling, while the price of the unit of iron stands between 6 shilling, it is an evidence that the economical principle which should guide the stocks of iron into the most remunerative employments is not fully carried out. Iron is being used in employments where the products fetch only 2 shilling or 3 shilling, where accordingly the use is less than the last economically permissible, and on the other hand there are still numerous employments unprovided for, where the products would obtain a greater value than 6 shilling. If, for instance, the market price of an iron product stands at 20, it is a proof that only those consumers of that product who value it at 20 and upwards are actually purchasing, while other consumers whose valuations range from 18 shilling down to 6 shilling are not supplied in the market. Similarly, with products whose market price stands at 16 shilling, there will be an unsatisfied layer of demand with a use for the product corresponding to the prices 14 shilling down to 6 shilling, and so on. Now this must be corrected, and the enterprise of undertakers will usually not be long in supplying the needed correction. The production of those iron wares, the price which still stands above 6 shilling, will, under the inducement of the premium offered by the difference between price and cost, be increased till all those employments where the utility is greater than the amount of 6 shilling are supplied. Of course this increase of supply has the effect of always reducing the level in which the last buyer is found, and thus the market price sinks till such time as the money valuation of the last buyer, and with it the market price, comes to the normal level of 6. Conversely, where iron has been put to employments whose products fetch less than 6 shilling, the loss that ensues will prevent more iron being thus employed. This will be brought about by a temporary suspension or limitation of the production of those iron wares, the market price of which is under 6 shilling. This limitation of supply will soon have the effect of raising the price to 6, and now, as the state of the case demands, the commodity, iron, will only be attainable by those buyers who can use it to make products that will fetch at least 6 shilling. Thus from above and from below all iron products come together at the price of 6, the amount of their cost, but quite evidently the cause of this is not that the cost good, iron, can force its own arbitrary fixed price on its products, but that all the products involved, including the cost good, iron, conform to the law of marginal utility, find their way successively into the most remunerative employments, and together receive their price as regulated by the last of these. Empirical proofs of this may be had in abundance. It is a very well known fact that active building of railways raises the price of rails, and through this the price of iron, that the present strong demand for copper wire in electric lighting puts up the price of copper. In these cases it is evident that the upward movement of price takes its start from the final products, and is transferred from these to the cost goods. But the objection will probably suggest itself to many readers, that there are also cases where the movement of price is from costs to products. The stocks of iron, for instance, of which we have been speaking in our illustration, are not a fixed amount, but are smaller or greater according to the circumstances of iron production. Now if there is an extension of this production, and the supply of iron increases, its price will certainly fall, and that from causes peculiar to the iron, and this fall in prices will drag down the price of iron wares. Does the causal connection here not run from costs to price of products? To answer this objection, we have only to carry the concatenation, of which we have hitherto examined only a few links, back to its beginning. It is quite correct to say that stocks of iron are not a fixed amount, but the varying result of a production which is capable of being extended or limited at will. For the production of iron, two things are necessary: mines, and to put it shortly, direct and indirect labor. The mines are a given quantity and cannot be devoted to the production of anything but iron. On the other hand, the quantity of labor available as a whole for economical employment is an amount given and limited by the current state of population. But this is not the case with that particular labor which is employed in the production of iron. Labor is a productive power capable of being employed in any number of ways, and all the branches of production carried on in a community compete for it. Who or what, now, is it that decides what exact proportion of the original productive powers at the disposal of industry, namely labor and uses of land, is employed in the production of iron, and who and what is it that decides on the value and price of the unit of those productive powers? Here, then, for the last time, is repeated in the elements of all economy the movement which we saw in the case of final products and intermediate products. The original productive powers in the nation force themselves into the most remunerative employments one after another, and receive their value and price from the last of these. As little as, perhaps even less than, any other good have they any a priori fixed value; they receive it only from the opportunities of employment. Whether the day's work is worth 2 shillings or 6 shillings depends on the worth of the product which can be turned out in a day's work, and, indeed, on the last product. The one worst paid for the production of which there is still enough labor for the necessary quality left, after all the better paid employments have been supplied. Production may be compared to a giant pump. Every branch of want has its separate pipe sunk down to the great reservoir of the original productive powers, and competes with all the other branches of want in trying to draw its supply by suction from that reservoir. Every branch has a different power of suction, the power increasing with the number and remunerativeness, that is to say, in the case of organized exchange, the money value of the employments it embraces. In the nature of the suction pumps, too, there is a difference. Many are quite simple; others have independent intermediate lengths that convey the pressure that comes from the want, as it were, by stages, and, in correspondence with that, the productive powers which supply the want are raised by stages. The simile extends still further. Such wants as demand personal services for their satisfaction attract labor quite directly, according to the payment which they can and will give for them. Such wants again as demand material goods for their satisfaction get these supplies first by payment of a market price which is remunerative in itself, and then the remunerative price of the products must attract the productive powers to their manufacture. Sometimes this is done through one or two, sometimes through 20 or 30 members. In our illustration, human demand asked and paid for iron wares. The market price of iron wares attracted people to the purchase of iron. The price of iron finally attracted the original productive powers to the production of iron. In the case of other consumption goods, the number of intermediate members, or, to keep to the terms in our comparison, the number of intermediate lengths in the suction pipe, may be double or 20 times as great, but the principle of the movement, and what chiefly interests us, the result is always the same. Whether there are many or few intermediate members may hasten or hinder the result, but cannot weaken or strengthen it. In the end, every want, according to the power expressed by its money valuation, draws to itself, mediately or immediately, the productive powers required for its supply. To supply the wants of the rich innumerable productive powers are always active, even if simultaneously at other points of the economy there is want both of men and goods. The reason of this is that the high figures which the rich are able to offer for the satisfaction of their wants never fail to exert and continue their attractive force through all the stages of production, right down to the reservoir of the original productive powers. Thus all human wants exert, as it were, a suction power indicated by the figures of their valuation. Now that layer of wants which is willing and able to pay, say 20 shillings and upwards, for the day's work devoted, mediately or immediately, to its satisfaction, is soon entirely provided for. After, if those layers, in succession, draw supply to themselves, which can and will pay the day's labor with 18, 16, 14, and 12, even down to 10, 8, 6, and 4 shilling. If at the limit of 4 shilling, the entire stock of original powers is required and is taken, this decides two things. All wants which will not or cannot pay the day's labor devoted to their service at 4 shilling remain unsupplied, and the market price of the day's labor will stand at the figure of the last buyer, namely 4 shilling. But if, as we may rather assume, the available quantity of labor is greater than this, the wants of still lower levels may be supplied. The last needs, mediate or immediate, which are supplied may be those that pay the day's labor at 2 shilling only, and in conformity, the market price of labor also will be fixed at this lower figure of 2 shilling. And indeed this market price will be a general one. The uppermost layer will not be paid 20 shilling, and the lowest layer 2 shilling for the same work or the same commodity. The market price will be the same for all buyers. And now we come in sight of the answer to the doubt suggested by our former illustration. Suppose that the price of the day's labor is 2 shilling, and the price of a hundredweight of iron, which takes 3 days to produce, is 6 shilling. Suppose now that all of a sudden new and productive mines are opened, or some great improvement in process discovered, which makes it possible to produce the hundredweight of iron in 2 days' labor. What is the consequence? So long as the iron and its products maintain the old price of 6 shilling, only those wants in the department of iron wares are supplied, which are able and willing to pay 6 shilling for 2 days' work, that is, to pay the day's labor at 3 shilling, while all round in other departments of want and branches of production, that layer of want is supplied which pays only 2 shilling for the day's labor. On economic principles which are willingly carried out by undertakers of industry, who are always ready to seize the chance of a profit when offered them, those opportunities of employment which pay the day's work at more than 2 shilling, and have hitherto been misapplied, will now be supplied. More original productive powers will, accordingly, be invested in the production of iron, and the supply of iron and iron products will be increased till such time as, here as elsewhere, that level of wants which is willing to pay the day's labor at 2 shilling is satisfied, and therefore the hundredweight of iron, which costs 2 days' labor, fetches 4 shilling. Parallel with this, of course, the price of iron and iron products goes down to the level of 4 shilling, and all this is not in opposition to, but in real fulfillment of our law of marginal utility, of which the law of costs, rightly understood, is only a special expression suitable to a special group of phenomena. If what is practically inconceivable, production were carried on in ideal circumstances, unfettered by limitations of place and time, with no friction with the most perfect knowledge of the position of human wants requiring satisfaction, and without any disturbing changes of wants, stocks, or technique, then the original productive powers would, with ideal and mathematical exactitude, be invested in the most remunerative employments, and the law of costs, so far as we can speak of such a law, would hold an ideal completeness. The complementary groups of goods from which in the long run the finished good proceeds would maintain exactly the same value and price at all stages of the process, and commodity would be exactly equal to its costs. These costs and their costs and so on, back to the original productive powers from which ultimately all goods come. But this ideal symmetry is traversed by two disturbing causes. The first of these I may call by the general name of friction. Almost invariably there is some hindrance, great or small, permanent or temporary, to the due investment of the original productive powers in the employments and the forms of consumption which are the most remunerative at the time. In consequence of the provision for wants, and likewise the prices, are somewhat unsymmetrical. Sometimes it is that individual branches of want are, relatively, more amply supplied than others, so that for instance in woollens, those wants are supplied which pays the day's labor indirectly at 1 shilling 8 pence only, while it may be that in copper goods no wants are satisfied which cannot pay 3 shillings for a similar day's labor. But sometimes it may be that groups of productive materials successively transformed till they are changed at last into the finished commodity are not equally valued at all stages of the process. If we compare the means of production to a stream, we might say that the stream is not, as it should be, of equal breadth at all stages of its course. From some disturbing cause or other there may be dams at certain particular points, and leakages at others, and these cause an unsymmetrical divergence of price compared with the prices obtained at stages before and after, or, as it is usually conceived and expressed, a divergence of the price of a product or intermediate product from its costs. Thus it is in our illustration of the iron, when production is suddenly cheapened from 6s. to 4s., as a consequence of the production of iron is at first increased and presses down the price of raw material, while the products of iron may still for some time maintain a price greater than their costs, but gradually the increase of supply presses forward to the later stages of production, passing from the production of raw materials to the manufacture of final products, and by reducing the price here also to 4s. Restores the disturbed symmetry between price and costs. In practical life such frictional disturbances are innumerable. At no moment and in no branch of production are they entirely absent, and thus it is that the law of costs is recognized as a law that is only approximately valid, a law riddled through and through with exceptions. These innumerable exceptions, small and great, are the inexhaustible source of the undertaker's profits, but also of the undertaker's losses. The second disturbing cause is the lapse of time, the weeks, months, years, which must stretch between the inception of the original productive powers and the presentation of their finished and final product. The difference of time in exerting a far-reaching influence on our valuation of goods makes a normal difference between the value of productive groups standing at different points of the production process, through which they must all pass, and is therefore a difference to be kept quite distinct from the unsymmetrical divergences caused by frictional disturbances. It is this second disturbing cause which gives rise to interest. Our further task will be to intercalate the theory of interest in its place within the value and price theory already outlined.